Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, all participants. I'm Faiz, greeting from Yogyakarta, Indonesia. I'm pleased to welcome you back to the second pre-event lecture, which is part of the Learning from Mangunwijaya workshop program, hosted by Department of Architecture, University Islam Indonesia and Museum Architecture Indonesia. The topic of this session is Mangunwijaya in Germany, which will be presented by Dr. Eduard Kögel. Good morning, Edward. Thank you for...
Good morning.
Yeah. Good morning, Edward. So let me briefly introduce Dr. Eduard Kögel. I studied urban and landscape planning at the University of Kassel and received his doctorate from the Bauhaus University in Weimar. He has researched and written widely on the history of Asian architecture. His book include, among others, The Chinese City and the Grand Documentation, Ernst Borgmann and Religious Architecture in China, and EXH Design. He is also a research consultant and program creator for ENCB, the IDES Metropolitan Laboratory Berlin, and created several exhibitions on contemporary Chinese architecture at the IDES Architecture Forum in Berlin. Since 2006, he has created the website ChineseArchitecture.com. He teaches regularly at the Technical University Berlin and the Bauhaus University Weimar, together with Sally Below. Good morning, Sally. And Moritz Henning. Also, he initiated the platform Encounter with Southeast Asian Modernism. Together with different partners, they initiated the following four projects: Encounters with Southeast Asian Modernism, Contested Modernities, Post-Colonial Architecture in Southeast Asia, Diploma in Architect, German trained Indonesia architect from the 1960s, and our program, Learning from Mangunwijaya. Dr. Kögel will give a deep insight into Yusuf Bilyarta Mangunwijaya's educational background in Germany. So I also want to greet all the pre-event research person, Mr. Sergius Sutanto. Selamat siang, Mr. Sergius Sutanto, and also Mr. Wiryono Raharjo, Pak Wing, Mr.
Good afternoon,
Good
everyone. Good to see you all.
And also Mr. Revianto Budi Santosa. And also I want to greet to Sally Below and Moritz Henning from CAM Encounters, and Miss Avianti Arman and Mr. Satyadi Sopandi from Museum Architecture Indonesia, and of course all lecturer and student from Bauhaus Universitat, Weimar, Germany, Kalasalingam Academy of Research and Education, India, National University of Singapore, Transit University Thailand, University of Indonesia, Universitas Gadjah Mada Indonesia, and also University Malaya Malaysia. And all lecturer and student from Universitas Islam Indonesia, thank you all for your present. Of course, I also want to greet family and relative of Father Yusuf Bilyarta Mangunwijaya.
Thank you very much for the invitation to give a speech about the time of Yusuf Bilyarta Mangunwijaya in Germany. It is a great honor to speak today to you, and I can say it was also for me a very interesting research to learn more about his studies and the time he was in Germany. And therefore, I prepared this lecture with four aspects. I will start in Munich, and this is where Mangunwijaya arrived in Germany and where he stayed his first days. And second, I will go to Aachen and look at his student days there, and also about the city of Aachen and the architecture that was built during the time he was there, and also, of course, the historic buildings which have been there already. And RWTH Aachen, where he studied, had also, I will look at the faculty and the professors and how they engaged in church design, because this was one of the reasons why Mangunwijaya came to Germany. And finally, the last part will be about the book Vastushitra and the presentation of German architecture within it. So I'm only looking at the images in this book, and this will be a different part. So the whole presentation today is split into two parts. The first 3 points will be the presentation I'm doing now, and then the fourth point will be a short film which is focusing on the book Vastushitra. So there will be a change from point 3 to 4. So we will start in Munich. Since Mangunwijaya, as we will see, came to Munich to study architecture and attend the 37th Eucharist World Congress, I have analyzed the context from the perspective of an architecture student and compiled what was offered there in this context. Since we have no records of him in Munich, and I know of only a very few sources that confirm his whereabouts, some uncertainties remain. When he arrived there, he was already a priest and had studied architecture in Bandung for a year. So he wasn't a complete greenhorn when he arrived in Germany. The 37th Eucharist World Congress was held from 31st August to 7th July to 7th August 1960 in Munich. It was the first major international event by the Catholic Church in West Germany after the war. The city recognized the opportunity to improve its reputation after the National Socialist period. So the population was therefore called upon to provide private accommodation for the visitors, but also to welcome the foreigners and make them feel at home. The visitors arrived at the new main railway station, which was rebuilt after being destroyed in the Second World War. Mangunwijaya also arrived here as he was attending this congress because he wanted to study architecture in Munich. The historic churches, which had been destroyed during the war, had already been rebuilt by 1960. The congress opened on 31st July with 80,000 visitors on Odeonsplatz, a central square in the city. A temporary altar with a canopy was erected there, which set out a positive signal with its light symbolic form. The closing event took place on 7th August on the Theresienwiese, where the famous Münch October Festival takes place. Altogether, more than 1 million visitors attended the different events. The slogan was Pro Mundi Vita, for the life of the world, which explicitly included the developing countries. Munich was a Catholic city, and in Germany the Catholic Church and the society were very happy that the World Eucharist Congress was held there after the war. By then, the Catholic Church had already planned the Second Vatican Council, which took place in Rome from 1962 to 1965. As a sign of reform, the Church used the event in Munich for innovations. The service was held in German and no longer in Latin. The priests stood facing the visitors and no longer with their back to them. The demands of the liturgical movement were taken up, which were then discussed and agreed at the Second Vatican Council. In Germany, for example, the religious philosopher Romano Guardini and the architect Rudolf Schwarz had already called for reforms in the late 1920s. In other words, churches were already being built after the Second World War that spatially anticipated the reforms of the council. During the World Congress, the Chapel of the Fear of God, here to the right, was consecrated in the former Dachau concentration camp. We do not know whether Mangunwijaya was present. In Munich, every visitor received a bag, which you see here in the middle, with a guide to Munich, a city map, and further information material on the different activities offered. The Catholic churches in Munich were certainly labeled in it, and as well all other events that took place. Among them was a consecration of a new church in Munich, which was designed by architect Sepp Ruf, who built a circular church with a central light funnel in the ceiling. The space offered maximum concentration with finely crowded brick walls and a fine wooden ceiling. Also here, it is not known whether Mangunwijaya found the time to visit the church during his stay. However, as a student who wanted to study architecture in Munich, he was certainly interested in such new churches. And if we look at the colored image here, we can see that there is a small gap between the roof and the wall, which is a topic that later would also come up in the churches built by Mangunwijaya. I therefore assume that Mangunwijaya saw also this exhibition curated by Sepp Ruf at the Academy of Arts on church building in Germany after the war. This exhibition was accompanied by a catalogue that presented the most important modern churches. It included projects by Dominicus Böhm, the father of Gottfried Böhm, who taught at the RWTH Aachen from 1963. The Church of St. Reinhold in Düsseldorf, designed by the architect Josef Lembruck, was also on display. Here we see the front wall with decorative glazing that is artistically designed, while the side walls have blinds that filter the daylight. The church tower stands freely next to the church as a support for the bells. It is astonishing how many examples from the Rhineland were shown in the exhibition. More than half of the more than 80 churches stood in the wider area of Cologne and Aachen. What they all have in common is that the light was filtered with openwork structures and that the material was often unrendered brick or concrete. Once again, briefly to the Second Vatican Council. Mangunwijaya was sent to Germany by Archbishop Sögijabranata in order to study architecture in Munich. This bishop really wanted to indigenize the still too colonial Catholic Church of Indonesia and wanted his talented young priest to become the architect of churches in Javanese style. The fact that he arrived in Munich just as the Eucharist World Congress of the Catholic Church was taking place was maybe a coincidence. The fact that Munich was a Catholic city probably played a greater role. In October 1962, Archbishop Sögijabranata took part in the opening of the Second Vatican Council in Rome, and he died in July 1963 in the Netherlands in the village of Stiel, which is around 80 kilometers from Aachen. Mangunwijaya was with him in his last hours. The most important results of the Council for the organization of church spaces are as follows. The altar takes center stage. The community becomes more important and is grouped around the altar. The priest faces the congregation. The floor plan of churches is liberated. If we take the aforementioned exhibition in Munich as a basis, it becomes clear that Archbishop Sögijabranata sent Mangunwijaya to Germany because there were clearly currents here that revolutionized church building before the Second Vatican Council had decided on general reforms. The catalogue for the exhibition in Münch also features many floor plans that show the new spatial organization. More than half of the exhibited churches had been in North Rhine-Westphalia, where Aachen is located, and where many new churches were built. The floor plans show a flexibility in dealing with space, which also assigns a new position to the decoration with the raw materials of brick and concrete. At the World Congress in Munich, Mangunwijaya met Vadiman Chochonegoro, who was studying engineering in Aachen, and pursued the architect student to come to Aachen. Chochonegoro was to become Minister of Education of Indonesia in 1993. Perhaps the exhibition of new churches, many of which were located in the greater Aachen and Cologne area, also helped him decide to study there instead of Munich. Chochonegoro wrote about his first meeting with Mangunwijaya, and I quote him. "It was at the Eucharist in Munich that I met Father Mangunwijaya. He was dressed in an all-black priest's habit, and as soon as we got to know each other, we hit it off. He told me that he had just arrived from Jakarta and would be studying architecture in Munich. I asked, why Munich? Munich is a big city for Catholics, but it would have been better if he had chosen a smaller city like Aachen. I was able to convince the father to move to Aachen, and I took care of the registration. I guided him through the registration and housing process." End of quote. By the time, Munich had about 1 million inhabitants, whereas Aachen had about 170,000. The following section is dealing with the city of Aachen and some churches there. This map of Germany shows the distribution of Catholics, and it becomes clear that in addition to Bavaria in the south, where Munich is located, there was also a high density of Catholics in the west, and thus a great need for new churches there after the destruction of the Second World War. Aachen is located in the very west of the Federal Republic of Germany, just 90 kilometers west of Cologne, and in the immediate vicinity of the Netherlands, Belgium, and not far from France. At that time, the West German capital was Bonn, which lies to the south of Cologne. The federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia is characterized by a large industrial heart of the Ruhr region in the center, the Bergisches Land region in the south, and large agricultural areas to the north. There were mining landscapes in the Ruhr region, but also between Aachen and Cologne. The Second World War was already over in Western Germany in October 1944, as the Allied forces advanced from the west. The cities were completely destroyed and were reduced to a landscape of ruins, as we see here in Cologne. But the city of Aachen was also just a field of rubble, with the inner city completely destroyed and more than 60% of housing as well. There were almost no buildings left with an intact roof. 15 years later, when Mangunwijaya arrived, the worst of the damage had been repaired, and the planners used the situation to implement new radical concepts for the separation of functions. Also, there was, of course, still a lot of damage. In detail, the infrastructure and the inner city had been renovated as part of the economic miracle. New symbols, such as a roundabout here, were developed for car traffic. Functional new buildings were constructed in the city center around the cathedral. The most historically significant building is certainly St. Mary's Church, a part of today's cathedral, which Carl had built between 793 and 813. He was also buried there after his death in 814. Carl is still regarded today as a great European, and since 1950, there has been a prize in his name that honors people who have made a strong contribution to the European idea. By 1960, the square in front of the cathedral had become a car park, and the new buildings displayed the typical language of reconstruction. The main aim was to close the gaps, but also to create space for modern new buildings whose function was not to be accommodated in the old existing structures. Opposite the cathedral is the old Gothic town hall from the 14th century, as we can see here, this one. And in between here is the cathedral, and in between there are this new building complex. Mangunwijaya was later to say that he had visited many churches in Aachen in order to learn from the best examples from different eras. Here we see an example from the beginning of the 20th century, where the architects still follow traditional ideas of a church interior. However, Aachen is also home to this church designed by Rudolf Schwarz at the end of the 1920s, which is radically characterized by white modernism. The white building is also largely unadorned inside. The furniture was designed by Hans Schwippert and the church banners by Anton Wendling. I mention this because they were later Mangunwijaya's professors. A new way of thinking about space began with the Catholic architect Rudolf Schwarz. In his opinion, the church interior had to be ascetic, devoid of images, empty, simple, austere, and unadorned in order to show the spiritual dimension and silence. His ideal was a rectangular single space in white. He favored sparse furnishing, tabernacle, baptism fonts, benches in silver or black. The altar was lightly raised as a threshold to God. In 1930, he realized the Corpus Christi Church in Aachen in this spirit. Romano Guardini, the mastermind behind the Catholic youth movement, wrote at the same time that the liturgy could only be carried out by the entirety of the faithful and not by a single person, meaning the priest. Architects such as Dominicus Böhm and Rudolf Schwarz, who exchanged ideas intensively with Guardini, gave architectural expression to these ideas. This church was built at the same time in Düren, just a few kilometers from Aachen, and it also radiates a new clarity. It appears far less radical than Rudolf Schwarz's church in Aachen. Of course, many Protestant churches were also destroyed during the war. Here is an example of a prefabricated church of Otto Bartning designed after the war and which was used in many places. The church in Aachen was destroyed by fire in 1979. I only can guess that Mangunwijaya was open to look at different churches, not only the Catholic ones, but also the Protestant ones. In Düren, around 40 kilometers from Aachen, an important church was built by Rudolf Schwarz. The old church had been destroyed in the war, and Schwarz was awarded first prize in the competition. The condition was that the stones of the old church had to be reused in the new building. Rudolf Steinbach, who was one of the most influential professors in Aachen during Mangunwijaya's studies, was in charge of the construction management of this church. The floor plan shows how the space is organized. Both spaces could be used together for important events with many visitors. But we also see that the new church is on top of the ground of the plan of the historic church, which was destroyed. Here you can see the tree of life to the right, which has been decoratively incorporated into the facade behind the altar using the existing stones. The backside shows the monolithic block with the finely joined reused stones of the old church. The concrete construction of the ceiling is simple and shown in its materiality. The use of simple materials with fine workmanship, but also the large glass wall, created a strong contrast in which the spatial quality is emphasized in its material presence. The quality of the workmanship, the integration of spoiler from the previous building, and the unconventional organization of the space made the church an important contribution to the discourse on new church architecture. Naturally, this church was also on display in the exhibition in Munich in 1960. Another church by Rudolf Schwarz, who himself died in 1961, was completed in Aachen by his wife Maria in 1964. The building is extremely sober and shows an almost industrial charm. The colored glass windows were only installed much later. It is a kind of skin and bones architecture in which everything distracting was left out. And we can be sure that Mangunwijaya also has seen this church, which was finished during his study time. The third section now is dealing with the professors and topics at the university. Aachen was home to the School of Architecture, which was founded in the 19th century and is still one of the most important schools in Germany today. Mangunwijaya came to Aachen in the autumn of 1960 for the winter semester. Before he could start, he had to complete a 6-week internship in construction. He worked in a carpenter workshop in the Catholic village of Emsburen, which is around 250 kilometers north of Aachen, in the German state of Schleswig-Holstein. It can be assumed that the Catholic Church in Aachen helped with the placement. After the war, the RWTH expanded considerably in the 1950s with many new buildings. Part of them was designed by the professors, part by the construction department of the university. The university's building department realized some of the new buildings, which clearly show that they were oriented towards the ideas of international post-war modernism. The Dutch Karel Steenbrink, a friend of Mangunwijaya, wrote about his studies, and I quote him. In Aachen, the young priest with the limited fellowship of 250 Deutschmark per month had to find his own way for his living and his studies. He was offered 3 possibilities: free lodging in a parish house, with some pastoral obligations, especially during the weekends; to stay free as rector in a nun's convent; to live as unpaid guard in a kindergarten with a free room in exchange for the obligation to stay in the building during nights and weekends in order to prevent theft and burglary. He chose the latter. And Steinbach was quoting Mangunwijaya, "If I would have accepted residence in a parish house or nunnery, the other Indonesian students never would have visited me." End of quote. Here to the right, we see his study book, or at least one page of the study book. Unfortunately, I do not know the study book itself. It would be of extreme interest if we could have a look on a copy of this study book, because then we can precisely see with which professors he did what kind of courses. So if anybody knows where this booklet is to be found, it would be really nice and helpful to give some hints. Here we have an overview of the most important professors of architecture in the 1960s. Those marked in red each have a whole series of churches in their portfolio. There was no such thing as a professor for church architecture. Anyway, the students could not choose anything in the foundation course, but all had to attend the same courses, and at the end of the semester there were really complex examinations. In the courses, many historical churches were covered, especially in building and art history, and with them the development of historical architectural styles. For the preliminary exam after 4 semesters, students had to work independently on a so-called small design. This usually involved designing a residential building, which was based at the Department of Construction. The design then had to be coordinated with the other chairs: statics, interior design, installation, drainage, and detailing. Not all professors had always the same opinion. In addition, a one-to-one design had to be submitted for furniture construction. After the preliminary exam, there was greater freedom in the selection of projects and also more excursions and site visits. Since the early 20th century, the architecture department had been placed in the Rijksmuseum. The collection of art initially served as to train architects and art historians at the college. At the beginning of the 1960s, the architecture department became larger and the art collection became less important. Rudolf Steinbach, a popular professor of building construction, expanded together with his assistants the Rijksmuseum. The existing building was extended with a new wing, and the top floor was also converted. And this is also where the architecture student later had their workspace to study. Steinbach was an important professor and also very influential for the students. There is a short story of a student from 1956 when Steinbach came excitedly into the lecture room and showed a new magazine in which the new Rochon chapel by Le Corbusier was shown. His presentation of the chapel was so enthusiastic that some students traveled to France the next day to see the building with their own eyes. While Steinbach was completely enthusiastic, critics spoke of a new Baroque and criticized the organic form. In addition to the organic floor plan, the treatment of light was an aspect that inspired many. The gap between the roof and wall also playfully stages the question of weight, an aspect that would later also appear in Mangunwijaya's work, for example in the Maria Assumpta Church in Gladen. In 1957, when Steinbach was commissioned to build a pilgrimage church in Zuchterscheid, a village in the Eifel region 120 kilometers from Aachen, he combined the natural stone wall we had already seen in the Church of St. Anna in Düren with aspects of Le Corbusier's concept in Rochon. On the one hand, the wall to the inner courtyard is pierced with colorful glass windows, while on the other, it integrates an existing chapel into the new building with an organic form. The protective quarry stone wall to the outside contrasts with the white openwork wall to the inner courtyard and the rough plasterwork inside, which is reminiscent to Rochon. Particularly striking here is the irregular ceiling construction, which stands in stark contrast to the white interior and the colorful glass wall. The small integrated chapel has been restored. There is, of course, no doubt that this concept was inspired by Le Corbusier Chapel in Rochon. At the beginning of the 1960s, there were more and more Muslim students at RWTH in Aachen. The university therefore decided to build a mosque designed by Steinbach. In the early 1960s, he traveled twice to Morocco and once to Egypt on excursions with students. He was interested in Oriental architecture and searched for a modern interpretation. After his death, his assistant completed the mosque. The building was originally a brutalist concrete structure. Originally, the square enclosed the relatively small prayer room and an inner courtyard with a fountain. A few years later, the room became too small and the courtyard was also built over. The prayer room had delicate pillars and 8 skylights, as well as a glazed end to the courtyard. Very little of the student designs from this period survived. Here are some random works that were made by students of Steinbach, which give a rough idea. However, up until today, no student work by Mangunwijaya has been discovered. Another important professor was Hans Schwippert, whom we already know from the white St. Corpus Christi Church by Rudolf Schwarz from the late 1920s in Aachen. Here in the photo, we see Schwippert in the background and Mangunwijaya in the front right in the new Steinbach building. Schwippert also built a number of churches, such as St. Paul's Church in Düsseldorf in the early 1950s. The new Romanesque church, built originally between 1910 and 1913, was largely destroyed in the Second World War, apart from the towers. Schwippert reconstructed the towers and erected the church building in a simplified form. The circular Hedwig Cathedral in East Berlin was also rebuilt by Schwippert after the war, as it had burned out and the dome had been destroyed. The artist involved was Anton Wendling, who also taught as a professor at the RWTH. Schwippert designed the St. Bartholomeus Church in Cologne with a freestanding tower. The concrete is visible in the interior while the exterior is clad in red brick. Hans Schwippert was a friend of Mies van der Rohe, who grew up in Aachen. Mies visited his hometown in 1959 and 1962. Maybe Mangunwijaya had the opportunity to see him in 1962, but this is unknown. Another professor with a strong commitment to Catholic Church building was Willy Weyres, who taught building history and monument preservation. He was also a diocesan architect for the cathedral in Cologne from the 1940s to the 1970s. Together with the art historian Wolfgang Braunfels, Weyres organized excursions along the River Rhine as far as France, which were dedicated to Western Church architecture. Every year, they traveled to Mainz, Worms, and Speyer to visit the Romanesque cathedrals. Every student took part in at least one such excursion, as examinations were later held on the churches and cathedrals visited. Weyres also found time to repair or rebuild a whole series of churches after the war. At the end of the 1940s, the main focus was on securing church premises and making them safe, again with the simplest of means. Or here, as a radical example, the transformation of an anti-aircraft bunker into a church. The huge concrete structure was built during the war with a round tower that simulated a church in the hope that this would protect the building. Weyres transferred this remain into a church. In the 1960s, he also built new churches, like here the St. Hedwig's Church in the capital Bonn. The floor plan here anticipates the reforms agreed at the Second Vatican Council. The altar is in the middle and the worshippers are grouped around the center in two room segments. It is for sure that Mangunwijaya had to study with Weyres. The professor for urban design and regional planning was Erich Kühn. At the end of the 1950s, he propagated the city of tomorrow, which was to be organized in manageable neighborhoods separated by green corridors, as can be seen here in the plan. He contributed his ideas to the exhibition Cities of Tomorrow at the International Building Exhibition at the Hansaviertel in Berlin in 1957. His urban concept was already clearly criticized in the early 1960s because, in the eyes of the critics, it prevented urban complexity and contradiction. With reference to Professor Kühn, there was a public rally in which Mangunwijaya, here to the right, was also involved. The slogan shown is a clear play on words that can be read in two ways. One, first, give our Kühn urban green. This refers to the professor who should be given more urban greenery. Secondly, the slogan also can be read differently, and I quote, give our cows urban green. This can also be understood as a criticism of Professor Kühn's urban concept, as his ideas were not shared by everyone, and there were also other opinions that called for urbanity through density. One of Kühn's assistants was Liborius Schellhase, who initiated a seminar Planning and Building in Warm Climate Zones in 1963, which Mangunwijaya described as an eye-opener for himself. Unfortunately, Schellhase was a very discreet teacher, and very little has been published about his 30 years of commitment. It therefore remains somewhat vague what exactly the content of his seminar on planning and building in warm climates was, and where he got his expertise from. Unfortunately, there are only incomplete statistics on foreign students in Aachen in the 1950s and none at all for the 1960s. In 1956, a total of 56 German students and one foreigner received a diploma in architecture. In 1958, there were 72 Germans and 2 foreigners. There were probably not many more foreign students in the early 1960s. Mangunwijaya later remembered the impact of Schellhase on his own ideas, and I quote him. During my last study years, however, a very good lecturer for town and regional planning from the faculty, Herr Diplom-Ingenieur Liborius Schellhase, managed to open my eyes to see the real problems of architecture in developing countries. He widened my horizon to discover and explore the other side of the moon. Aesthetic dimensions remained important, of course, but it was not the core of the problem in developing countries. And maybe it was not even the problem of architecture of our whole global civilization. This new dimension of architecture, which Herr Liborius Schellhase implanted in my mind on the perfect time, only a year before I finished my study in the Aachener Fakultät für Bauwesen, became the first seed that later grew into the idea of Vastu, a central idea I developed during my 12 years lecturing on architecture and Lebensanschauung, philosophy of life, in the Gajah Mada State University of Yogyakarta. End of quote. An architect and professor in Aachen who was very noticed for his church buildings was Gottfried Böhm, whose father, Dominikus Böhm, was already an important church architect. However, his teaching in Aachen focused on completely different topics. He was interested in the city as a whole, and he had the vision of a new city in the border triangle of Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. True to the motto, a house like a city like a house, the students worked on new ideas of urbanism, which clearly criticized the separation of functions in the 1950s. One of his assistants, Hans Schmalscheid, remembered Böhm's early years in Aachen. However, when asked by our colleague Björn Schötten, he could not remember Mangunwijaya in the courses of Böhm. It is therefore unclear whether he ever studied at this chair, whose program was in opposition to Professor Erich Kühn. Böhm did not give any regular lectures, but only gave one overview lecture once a semester to introduce the students to the work of his office, which included many churches. In the beginning of his career, Gottfried Böhm worked in his father's office. The first own commission was the Columba Chapel in Cologne, which is also called Madonna in the Rubble. The old church had been destroyed in the war, and a figure of Madonna was found in the ruins, which then occupied an important place in the chapel. At the first, the octagonal part was filled with transparent glass, which was later replaced by a colorful artwork. The chapel was built over and integrated into the new building for the Diocesan Museum by Peter Zumthor, which opened to the public in 2007. The chapel is still accessible today independently of the museum. In 1964, Böhm realized the St. Hubertus Church in Aachen as a folded concrete structure, the interior of which showed the material in a brutalist architectural language. It can be assumed that this church was known to the students and that Mangunwijaya also saw it. Between 1962 and 1965, Böhm built another concrete church near Cologne, which was clad at the outside with brick. Here too, he worked sculpturally with the material, and the folded space shows expressionist tendencies. Eleanor von Erdberg was a professor of East Asian art architecture and Chinese archaeology. She dealt with art and religion in Asia, published on Taiwanese architecture and feng shui. Her seminars focused on Japanese architecture and its influence on modernism and American housing, or with the main works of historical architecture in Asia. It would be surprising if Mangunwijaya had not attended these seminars. In general, one can say that such a professorship, which also linked to the architecture faculty, was quite special in Germany. The artist Anton Wendling, who designed many church windows, was a professor of watercolor and freehand drawing, with a focus on woodcuts and stained glass. The topic of artistic design of church windows also played an important role for Mangunwijaya. It can therefore be assumed that he learned from Wendling and from the many new churches in the region with artistic design of religious spaces. This was a relatively simple way to integrate local themes that were easy to understand as a visual message. Wendling has designed in many churches different glass walls, but also sgraffitos. Here is the church in Aachen, the side wall of which he designed in a very pictorial way. His style came from expressionism, but he also realized abstract compositions. He certainly thematized his work with the students until he left the university in 1965. And I think the influence of Wendling can be seen in the case of Mangunwijaya at the Maria Assumpta Church in Gladen, and in part also in other works. Towards the mid-1960s, students in Germany slowly became more critical of the professors and initiated provocative events with artists. There was one event in 1964 with the Fluxus artist Wolf Vostell in the architecture department, who wanted to convert the Aachen Cathedral into an everyday object in a pop art style. We don't know what Mangunwijaya thought about this, but he probably didn't approve of an attack on the representative building of the Catholic Church. His friend Karel Steenbrink, who was an authority on Christianity and Islam in Indonesia, wrote, and I quote him, "Mangunwijaya was sent to Europe for the study of architecture. He took the opportunity to see many aspects of Western Europe. He traveled extensively, helped by the network of Indonesian students, mostly Muslims, but in this case, the common nationality overcame the difference of religion. His bishop, however, once did not allow him to attend a students' conference in communist Moscow, at that time the ideal center for many leftist students." When Mangunwijaya began studying architecture in 1960, there were 566 students, and 37 received their diplomas the same year. In 1966, when he graduated, there were 676 students and 63 theses. He received a very good grade for his work, the best possible grade that was very difficult to achieve. If we now summarize Mangunwijaya's time as a student, it becomes clear that on the one hand, the professors built many churches and also contributed to their furnishings. This influence is particularly visible in the early works in Yogyakarta, where ideas from his student days were transferred into a locally based architecture that also incorporated the reform ideas from Germany. When he came to Germany, he was over 30 years old and was certainly very focused in his studies. And here is another quote from Steinbach. In 1967, he returned to Java. The new bishop of Semarang, Justinus Darmoyuwono, did not dream of great cathedrals in Indonesian style, but wanted small, unembellished and simple church buildings. Mangunwijaya was proud that the first church, Maria Assumpta in Kladen, was built without foreign capital. Since 1969, Mangunwijaya was also part-time lecturer in architecture at the Gadjah Mada University of Yogyakarta. He taught cultural history of architecture, or as he would call it himself, architecture and building as expression of mankind all over the world. The courses resulted in a splendid book with many photographs, not only of buildings, but also of streets, slums on the border of a dirty river, parks, statues, groupings of people who form a structure in space by dancing, and even of architectural views of nature. The book Steinbach was talking about is Vastu Chitra. The last part is now about the book Vastu Chitra and the architecture in Germany depicted in it. However, I also have some examples from neighboring countries if they illustrate certain topics particularly well. The image quality in the book is a challenge because the well over 1,000 illustrations are printed from copies. I will point out this in a few places. For reference, I always display the page number in the book at the top right of my presentation, and I used contemporary images in order to show his intentions. The text in the book does not always refer to the images so that they stand like their own visual narrative alongside the text, which is often accompanied by quotes from philosophers. Since I do not speak Indonesian, I focus totally on the images. Let's take a quick look back at the context in which the book can be seen. From November 1964 to February 1965, the exhibition Architecture Without Architects, curated by Bernhard Rudowski, took place at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, in which vernacular and traditional architecture was presented. This topic did not come to German universities during Mangunwijaya's time as a student. Nevertheless, in the years that followed, the catalogue conveyed new ideas that gave vernacular architecture and thus the anonymous cultural achievements a new value. However, there are no examples from Indonesia in the book, as the compilation was rather random and not based on systematic research. At the end of the 1970s, the Norwegian Christian Norberg Schulz published the book Genius Loci Towards the Phenomenology of Architecture, which primarily shows examples from Europe and how they integrated into their natural and topographical environment. This brought out the connection between environment and architecture. When Mangunwijaya compiled the book Vastuchitra, he certainly knew both books, but he also knew a lot of modern buildings which he brought together alongside the vernacular and traditional solutions. As Stanbrink wrote, and I quote, he taught cultural history of architecture, or, as he would call it himself, architecture and building as expression of mankind all over the world. End of quote. These ideas are summarized in his book and with a wide variety of examples from all over the world illustrated. I look at which examples from Germany he used for this. On page 210 we find an illustration of the Church of St. Bonifatius in Freckenhorst, which dates from the Romanesque period around 1129. Freckenhorst is about 220 kilometers northeast of Aachen, and it is possible that he visited the church. The church is part of a monastery, and many components and furnishings date from the 10th century. He was interested in the idea of the heavenly Jerusalem, God's fortress, which is expressed in the massive architectural design. The place to the left has been used for Marian pilgrimages since the middle of the 15th century. The Holy Blood Pilgrimage Church is located in Neukirchen in Bavaria on the border with the Czech Republic and dates back to the early 18th century. Mangunwijaya used her onion dome to show, with the tower of the Siuada Mosque from 1952 in Yogyakarta, that certain shapes are used symbolically for different religions. St. Peter's Cathedral in Worms, Speyer Cathedral and Mainz Cathedral were the destination of an annual excursion by his professors in Aachen. This means that every student in Aachen had to go to Worms, Speyer and Mainz to visit the respective cathedrals, which could then also be a topic for the examination. The cathedral in Worms dates back to the 12th century and was built in the transition from Romanesque to Gothic, as aspects of both architectural styles are present. Els Castle from the 12th century is located about 150 kilometers south of Aachen. The castle is still privately owned today and is one of the best-known complexes of its kind in Germany. The complex, which is made up of different components, was completely renovated in the 19th century and is optimally fitted into the topography. The additive arrangement of the building volumes gives it a romantic character. The Neuschwanstein castle complex, which was built as an idealized medieval castle in the 19th century by the Bavarian King Ludwig II, also uses the topography to fully showcase itself. Things are completely different with the expressionist Einstein Tower by Erich Mendelssohn, which was built in Potsdam in the early 1920s. Here, the facade suggests that the building is at least 5 stories high. In reality, however, 2 windows on top of each other are always 1 floor, so the building only has 3 floors. In this photo, you can clearly see that the structure looks like a toy with the large trees in the background. Mangunwijaya certainly didn't see this building because it was in the GDR and he didn't go there after the wall was built in 1961. The chapel in Rochon by Le Corbusier plays a special role for Mangunwijaya. The vertical line is omitted here. The outlines are femininely curved, full of poetry. The rough, uncivilized is expressed in the fine translation. The poetic narrative was later also developed by Mangunwijaya in his designs, with which he could transport religious and Javanese cultural values in a modern design language. Rochon, of course, also has sculptural qualities, as if carved from a block. An irregular space, decorations of Christian natural symbols, openings for the control of daylight, so that we can speak of a machine to transform architectural themes into a poem in space. This relative small building had a big influence. Also in this church in Switzerland, the impact of Le Corbusier is present. The church with organic floor plan is located in Sarnen, which was designed as a fortress of faith, the fortress Jerusalem. I guess both the unusual form and the translation of the fortress Jerusalem made this church interesting for Mangunwijaya. An example by the Italian architect Luigi Moretti shows a group of houses by the sea, which, with an organic floor plan and closed external shape, show a defensive character that is reminiscent of the castles of the Middle Ages, partly shown in the book Vastushitra. The Protestant church in the former Dachau concentration camp near Munich is organically integrated into the site. The cave-like sequence of spaces leads visitors to the church interior. The material concrete is partly plastically shaped in the style of brutalism. This church obviously made a lasting impression on Mangunwijaya, as it is shown twice in the book. The materiality and lighting reflect the location in the former concentration camp. On the opposite page in the book Vastushitra, there is a picture of the church in Neviges by Gottfried Böhm. Mangunwijaya shows the pilgrimage church of Böhm in Neviges without going into further detail. From the statements about similar spatial expressions, it can be assumed that he was fascinated by the lighting as well as the sculptural design. The temporary so-called Märzbau by artist Kurt Schwitters was built in Hanover in 1923. The expressionistic deconstructive form set against functionalism thought new parameters in architecture, which were partly realized in Gottfried Böhm's concrete works. The expansion of the church St. Jacobus in the Bavarian village of Ornbau is special because a simple church was expanded with a concrete structure so that it fits almost naturally into the village ensemble. Mangunwijaya incorrectly wrote that the church was destroyed in the war and then rebuilt. Such small errors can be found in Vastushitra in different examples. Inside, however, it becomes clear that only fragments of the old church remain, and a tent-like space covers and integrates them. This approach to integrate old and new shows the sensitive discourse between external form and internal function, or spatial expansion. Rudolf Schwartz's church is characterized by a strict grid that is broken by the artistic treatment of the windows. The contrast between rational space and emotional control of light is in tension. Here we see the complex for BMW in Munich, which was designed in the early 1970s by architect Karl Schwanzer. In the background is a high-rise car park that was of interest to Mangunwijaya and which he included on a double-page spread in his book. The garage is built from solid prefabricated parts, which in a modular arrangement represent an independent building volume in the urban space. Here too, the massive materiality is an essential feature of the architecture, regardless of the function. Mangunwijaya wonders how usage and expression fit together here. In addition to the architectural theme of mass and sculptural form shown so far, Mangunwijaya repeatedly uses examples of seemingly light architecture. In this way, he shows the transparency in the Gothic period, which was particularly important in a light-poor era like Europe after Mangunwijaya. The rising of the slender pillars became an impressive Gothic-like display with colorful church windows. The modulation of light and the image of a forest, and thus in nature, became an important motif, for example at Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which was built in 1248. The Seine steelworks are located south of Aachen on the River Rhine. The industrial hall from 1830, the early days of industrialization, is a transparent building in which inside and outside are connected. The materiality of cast iron prefabricated construction and glass shows the technical possible of the time, almost appearing like a three-aisle basilica. In the reprint used by Mangunwijaya and shown here on the right, a lot of imagination is needed to understand the quality of the real building. Mangunwijaya was obviously fascinated by transparent church interiors. He used this example from Italy twice in the book Vastukshetra. The steel construction is minimized. The concrete base and the outer skin of glass reflect the new self-image of the church. The polystyrene arranged between the two panes of glass gives the church an eternal white glow. The functionalism and the image of a church created with new materials are fascinating. Here the church after renovation, with its glowing interior and its white volume from the outside. The Church of St. Pius in Mecken, Switzerland, designed by architect Franz Voigt between 1964 and 1966, continues to set standards to this day and is unmatched by any other building in its consistency of pure construction and use of materials. While the church appears from the outside as a functional white steel structure, the marble wall inside, just 28 mm thick, glow in the colors of daylight. The entire 13 meters high cube is transformed with the simplest of means into a secret experience space that leaves an unforgettable impression. For Mangunwijaya, building with light was a continuation of Gothic ideas with modern materials and technologies. In the case of the Olympic roof in Munich by Günter Benisch, Frei Otto and others, Mangunwijaya is concerned with the modern cable construction and the necessary engineering components. Secondly, he thematizes the Olympic roof as an open, spatial form that nevertheless has a national significance. Inside and outside are not separated by walls, but the space is defined by the roof alone. I now come to a short summary. The examples from Mangunwijaya studies in Aachen, shown in the first section of my lecture, obviously had a significant influence in his practice, especially in his first churches, like St. Maria Assumpta in Gladen. Of course, he did not transplant copies from Germany or Europe, but developed an architecture adapted to the local culture and climate in a creative process. In addition to the building form and spatial concept, the decoration of his buildings is also clearly characterized by conceptual ideas from his student days. Colored stained glass windows, constructive details, decorative sgraffitos, and reliefs bear witness to his exploration of the themes of his student days. These themes can also be found in the visual narratives in Vastukshetra, without the examples from his student days in Aachen being utilized. As I mentioned at the beginning, I naturally approach the book Vastukshetra not through the text, as I don't speak Indonesian, but through the images used and their origins in Germany and the nearby countries. The idea behind this was to find out whether buildings from his student days played a role in the conception of the illustrations in Vastukshetra. This can actually be largely denied, as the book contains over 1,000 illustrations from almost all parts of the world. The buildings that he might have seen as a student can be counted on one hand in the book. As Karel Steenbrink his friend wrote, and I quote him, "He taught the cultural history of architecture, or, as he himself called it, architecture and building as an expression of man in the whole world." End of quote. I will end here with a quote by Mangunwijaya. With this book, entitled Vastu Chitra, I want to say goodbye to a beautiful world in which architecture is viewed from the perspective of a foreign paradigm. And I want to invite young people in particular to think about questions like this. What kind of architecture, or rather Vastu, do we need in Indonesia? How should Vastu become conceptualized, approached and treated in Indonesia for the benefit of the whole people and especially for the benefit of the disadvantaged majority of Indonesians? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kögel. Wow, appreciation for Eduard for the insightful presentation. It was great to listen to the story of Mangunwijaya before he became a professional architect and educator, and also interesting how German architecture seems to have a lot of influence of him. Dr. Eduard also shared about German architecture and its history. That is very insightful. Thank you so much, Eduard. Before we start, I want to say hello to Dean, our Dean, Pak Prof. Ilya. Selamat bergabung, Pak. Okay. I would like also to mention about the workshop program titled Learning from Mangunwijaya. Is initiated and organized by University Islam Indonesia, seam.encounters, and Museum Architecture Indonesia that will be held during May to August. So please don't miss it. All right, it's time to jump into our discussion. For our fellow participants, please share your thoughts or questions using the raise hand button or write them in the chat box. I will read it for you. Firstly, we would love to hear from Mr. Moritz Henning. Is there any experience or thought that you can share here, sir? Yeah, waiting for Moritz, and also Pak. Yes, very thanks to Pak Agus Tridiatno for joining us. Would you mind to join the discussion, sir? Ya. Selamat siang, Pak Agus. Pak Agus, who is actively communicate with Father Mangunwijaya family and also the lecturer from Faculty of Theology at Atmajaya University, Yogyakarta. Okay, please, Moritz, maybe you want to share something from the public.
Yes, thank you for asking me, which comes a bit surprising. But interestingly, what I just thought that I have to learn much more about German church buildings because of the huge variety Eduard showed to us that might have been influences on Mangunwijaya. For me personally, is that I'm not an expert in church buildings. I never built a church as an architect, and during my time at university, the design of churches was not an issue. It was only I remember that the only church we dealt with at my study time was the chapel of Longchamp by Le Corbusier that Eduard told me. So that was the only church building I remember from my study days. So and in fact for me here in Germany, discovering Mangunwijaya's work and some of his churches during my stay last year in Yogyakarta really opened my eyes for church buildings here in Germany, because I was looking for where did his ideas come from, and then did his studies really influence his work there? And then Eduard and me, we from time to time we discussed which churches might be influential on Mangunwijaya, and that was really a kind of backwards looking to our own history of church building, inspired by Mangunwijaya's work. That was funny. So, and coming back to Mangunwijaya, it's really astonishing how he translated things he has seen in Germany, how he translated this, especially in the church in Klaten, but then enriched things with this kind of colorful paintings, with the carvings, how he did, for example, in Klaten, how he did the columns with the decorative pattern on it, or going to Sendang Sono with all these turning elements of the construction into very decorative parts of the building, and that went very far away from the very let's say minimal structures of our post-war church buildings. As you remember, we somehow had, or Eduard showed this skin and bones churches, which sometimes look like industrial buildings. So, and maybe Mangunwijaya had a look at these buildings from the structural part and from the way the light comes into the buildings, and but then turn things into a completely different way of building in Indonesia. And this is super interesting to see, and I'm very thankful for learning this for having learned this from Eduard. So that's maybe my brief comment.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Yeah. Any feedback maybe from Eduard?
Well, I mean, you know, time is always short, and so I had to focus the lecture on certain aspects, and so I tried, of course, to focus on church and church decorations and how he translated things. And I mean, I did not include his own work, which would be, of course, even more interesting, but would have also not been possible within the given time. So I concentrated really on the context in which he studied. And but I think, you know, in the workshop, this will be a very big opportunity to compare what he has seen and what he has studied and then translate it into a contemporary modern form, which is indeed local on the one hand, but on the other hand, informed of international ideas that were floating around the world. And he could pick out things that gave it a distinctive local character. And I think this is something which we really also can learn today, to integrate topics that are floating around and then grip them and transform them, not just copying. I mean, this would be the wrong thing to do.
Yeah. Thank you, Eduard, for the feedback. I think I want to hear also from Pak Agus, Mr. Agus. How are you, Pak?
Okay, it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you very much for this this seminar or lecture. Actually, I am not architect, so I am not concerned for the topics, but I concern more on social activities of Father Mangun. That's why I do know more. But I know the church Klaten. I went there. I know well also the church in Klaten, Maria Sumta, I know also Sendang Sono, also in actually Salam. Also there are some building which was built by Father Mangun. But now my comment, just a short comment, because my concern more on social activities. That is why I joined this program, especially for how to promote Father Mangun as a national hero. Actually, from my point of view, I am an alumnus of philosophy and theology, and where Father Mangun also studied in this faculty. That is why my friend and me also want to promote Father Mangun as a national hero. And then thank you very much for this help. And here there's also the brother of Father Mangun, Pak Bob, also come here. So thank you very much for UEE. I hope that you help me or you help us to promote Father Mangun as a national hero. That's my concern. Thank you, Pak. Thank you. That's my comment.
Thank you, Pak Agus. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
this is my Pak Bob. Yeah.
As Pak Agus mentioned, we very grateful because a family from Father Mangunwijaya, Pak Bob. Selamat siang, Pak Bob. Good afternoon, and also Pak Jaka also join us today. So we would like to hear from you, Pak Bob and Pak Jaka, if you want to share something about about Mangunwijaya and his process. Oh, sudah bisa, Pak Bob. Silakan.
Sudah
Pak Bob.
bisa. Ya.
Silakan, ya.
Okay. Good afternoon, dear all of you. Thank you for the invitation to participate in the seminar or the lecture from Professor Eduard and the colleague. When I was still young and Father Mangun studied in Aachen, maybe it's a very big difference age, because he was so, I'm still very, very young in the elementary school. At the time when I was still very, very young, he asked me, descent from Aachen, that I have to collect some local materials from Indonesia, like bamboo or like small stones. Look at the local materials here. And yes, you have to send to Aachen. But I don't know why he asked that. Maybe in the long process, I just realized that Mother Mangun has the concept of local wisdom to what we call it, to construct or to make some architecture, Indonesian architecture, with the local wisdom. But in this case, I just want to ask you, he studied long in Aachen, in West Germany, in the Western concept, and he saw many buildings there, like cathedral and Gothic, or in the Roman architecture. I don't know, but why he just still create the buildings here, architecture, maybe the church in Indonesia or the housing in Indonesia, but I don't see any influence at all. The concept of the Western or the German architecture. But he studied in Germany, in Aachen. But as far as I know, but I don't see any creation here that was influenced by the concept of architecture or the Gothic architecture or Western architecture there. So that is my question only. Thank you.
Maybe I can give an answer, which probably is not I only can now make an interpretation, of course. And as we know, in the 1960s, when he was studying in Aachen, the historic styles of Romanesque or Greek architecture, which was formerly a representative also for church architecture in the colonies, was something that was not discussed at all. I mean, it was overcome by modernism. So that means, that the teaching on practicing architecture was completely on modern architecture, which means starting by construction, and then, of course, also by the question how to filter the light and create a space inside, which is special to the community. And I see quite a lot of references in the work of Mangunwijaya, which have been also discussed here in Germany in the time, but he made his own translations. So that means that he did not take the symbolic elements, but he took the essence of things. And I mean, this is something which then became a local force, a local part of the architecture, which today can be read as something very local and not being influenced from the outside, as long as you do not know the discourse he was in it during the time in Germany. And this is something I myself realized in preparing this lecture, that in the time when he was studying, there was an intense discourse, especially on church buildings, especially on Catholic church buildings, because quite a few architects wanted to reform the architectural expression for Catholic churches. And he came into the middle of this discourse. And Germany or German architects already had departed from the official guidelines in Rome before the discussion of the Second Vatican Council was ended. And therefore, I think this was the reason why he was sent to Germany for studying and not to any other country. I mean, because there was a step ahead of church architecture and church building in the time. I mean, this was also something that was expressed in this exhibition I showed in 1960 in Munich, where all these new churches were shown, which really had reference to the discourse that just took place and was not yet decided.
Yeah.
So what is your impression? Maybe I just want to ask you, what kind of the significant characteristic of Father Mangun that resulted from study from Aachen, and what kind of diploma he has got from there?
Well, I mean, the diploma is simple because there was the Diplom Ingenieur, which was handed out to every student who passed the examination, and he did the best grades ever. So he was a very top student. There is no question about this. And I think if I try to reflect what he took from Aachen, I think it is a critical reflection how to translate local topics into a universal language. I mean, this language he is using in architecture is understood as an architectural language first, and then it is placed in a locality where it belongs to. So it has both informations, the local information as well as the information from a global discourse. And I think he was a very critical thinker also for social, political, and other aspects, which came out in his writings, of course. And this also is reflected in his architectural thinking, that he was always trying to be critical And therefore, I think he is really a person you can learn still today quite a lot. And I think that it is one of the important aspects to bring him beyond Indonesia, to bring him onto a global stage of discourse, because I think that he is an architect that deserves to be discussed in a global discourse, simply because he was so clever and so interesting in his translations into an architecture that has to say more than just a space or a representative of the church or something. It's much more.
Yeah. The last question.
A cultural achievement, actually.
Oh, yeah, yeah. The last question. Do you think there is any relation from his work of architecture into his concept of humanity or social kind of activities, something like that?
Yes, I think so, because quite a few of his buildings are quite open. They have limited walls and they are open to the environment in inviting people on a meeting place. So he is very interested in creating spaces which can be used by many people together, and that actually brings a communicative element into the discourse. And I think this is a very important aspect today, which goes beyond religion. It is about society, it is about discourse between different opinions, and gives an open-minded opportunity to the form that is created in architecture.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question and also join our discussion. I noticed Mr. Ilya, would you mind to share your thoughts, sir? Mr. Ilya is the Dean of Civil Engineering and Planning Faculty of Universitas Islam Indonesia. Please, Pak.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm sorry for being late because I'm on the way from a meeting. I really thankful for Professor Kögel, who has already given a very deep insight of the work Romo Mangun as a generation who only met with Romo Mangun very, very short. Fortunately, I studied in the campus where the building were designed also by Romo Mangun. So to some extent, I know maybe the background why Romo Mangun designed like that. And what I have already typed in the chat room, I'm really impressed by and maybe to some extent given a term in Javanese term as empu, who can transcend almost any kind of material, not only as a structural or architectural elements, but as a way of communication between things, just like your expression of translation. And this translation or this communication or der Dinge, die sie sprachen, the speak that by itself, indeed really, really giving the opportunity to show very local material in the very global discourse of things. And that's maybe one of my expression of Romo Mangun when he quote unquote left from architectural teaching, and I saw it as a mode of subversion, subversive, to protest of how rather narrow-minded of education at that time, not giving the opportunity to open the discourse in multiple ways and multiple dimensions, maybe. And maybe it is also really related with the position of Romangun as a social being, as a activist in kampung. So I think and I think this is the value from Romangun, which is really difficult to follow. But I think this is also the quote unquote the lesson that we should try to achieve. And in terms of the education, maybe this is also one of the quality that we always try to pursue, to give the opportunity of the unspoken languages to be spoken in wider discourse. And for that, I think I'm very thankful for Professor Kögel, because it's connect my quote unquote maybe my conjecture at that time during my initial meeting with Romangun, or impression from distance in campus at that time. And it's like a confirmation that, okay, maybe this is the Romangun, really Romangun idea. And maybe I think this is really also important to be elevated in national as an official maybe position of this thought. And I do really agree if we can push forward as a national hero. I think it is also really nice. One of architects who are very welcome in international level, and also very not only talented, but is I would say like ampu in our time, on how to give the opportunity of any kind of material as a soul. Thank you, Prof. Kögel, and everyone who are joining this seminar. Really thankful, and also nice to be here as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Ilya, for the sharing. Yeah, I'm afraid our time it's also it's two times. So I would like to read the question from the chat box. Yeah, there is 1,000 here. So I think I will choose from Muhammad Iqbal Suryo Utomo from Universitas Gadjah Mada. Good afternoon. Thank you for an exciting explanation, Mr. Eduard Kögel, enabling us to know deeply about Romo Mangun, especially when he was in Germany. My name is Muhammad Iqbal from the University of Gadjah Mada. I'd like to ask for a question. as a human, sometimes we have feeling to evaluate. If we were studying abroad, should have done this and that, and want to come back in order to improve our previous study. So was there any kind of the thinking from Romo Mangun in his returning to Indonesia, and which if he could rewind the time, he would do something better over there, either for his country or at least for himself? And how did he deal with it? Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the answer. Kind regards.
Well,
So,
it is a very difficult question, which it's hard to answer. I mean, I have no idea how he would react today. I mean, the information flow is so different today. I mean, we have to remember that in the beginning of 1960s, there was no computer, there was no internet, there was only being there and being exposed to an information that had to be human by human, you know. I mean, it was information was flowing from one person to the other, and then of course you had books and magazines and so on. So I think it is very, very difficult to turn time back and to think what else could have happened or could happen today. I think one aspect that is, of course, always very interesting is expose yourself to the remotest culture you can imagine, and then try to understand and make as big mistakes as you can, because then you create something new. You know, if you try to make interpretation of something you didn't really understand, it is the best opportunity that something new comes out. So this needs a lot of try and error, of course, but I think that this could be a method, you know, not being afraid of failures and going on and trying to interpret different aspects you getting hold of during your study time, and asking always the question, how can you contribute with what you are doing to a wider society, not only to the client, not only to architectural history or whatever, but to the people who are using those buildings. And I think Romo Mangun was someone who really understood that and really also made a big contribution in these respects.
okay, thank you for the answer, Edward. Yeah, I'm afraid I cannot read all the questions, but thank you very much for the participation of for this lecture. So, I would like to say hello to Mas Haris and also Dr. Sarizi from University of Malaya. Selamat siang. Thank you for thank you for joining us.
Thank
Today.
you.
Yeah.
All right. Okay,
Okay.
because I just joined in just now. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm in terms of knowledge at the Indonesia regarding the architecture in Indonesia. For me, it's quite new for me. Okay, I'm more familiar about the rest of other than Indonesia, but it's so excited for me to hear the lecture just now lah regarding the church and so on. Hopefully to meet all of you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I've read this is the last things, but not the least, because we still have until August the program. I mean, like, so yeah, don't miss it for May 31. Another pre-event lecture titled Architecture and Creative Process or Mangunwijaya. That will be a gift from Pak Wiryono Raharjo. Okay, in closing, reflecting on Mangunwijaya impact and legacy during our discussion here has been both enlightening and inspiring. As we depart from his lecture, let us continue to draw inspiration from his vision and commitment to creating a more equitable and sustainable future for all. Thank you again to Mr. Eduard Kögel and all the participants. I think, yeah, I should to close the session. See you in the next lecture. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.